Good afternoon.
To you. We are dealing in Atlantic Currents, our annual report on wide Atlantic perspectives and patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And in the news too often these days is the COVID-19 crisis. Now our expert, Mina Baliamoune, has written and thought about saving human lives to save the economy. No dilemma, but special challenges in the global south. Now, my question is, in your study, you mention a dramatic choice to be possibly implemented about how to deal with the survival of large proportions of the world population. The question has been asked, would it be necessary to reopen the economy, even if it means sacrificing lives? You refer to an ongoing debate whether we should save lives or save the economy. So which is your position in this very crucial debate? Or let's ask it differently, what is the solution?
Okay, first of all, thank you for having me. And I must first note a disclaimer that during this interview, this is my opinion, personal opinion, and it's not the opinion of my employer or any past or present affiliation. Okay, now to your question. Yes, there was part of time, actually the debate probably is still going on in some countries, but last year especially, there was this thinking or this idea that there might be a dilemma or a trade-off between human life, saving human lives and saving the economy. And this is, of course, as I note in the study, this is a false choice. And any policy that's based on this type of ideas would be misguided completely and could, in fact, harm lives more than COVID-19 would do to the lives of people. So this dichotomy is completely misguided. And of course, some were thinking that we might just allow the economy to operate in the hope that we will get like 75 or 80% of the population infected and get the so-called herd immunity. The problem with that type of thinking is that there was so much we ignored about this disease and this virus. And up to today, we don't really know everything about it. We do not, for example, know what's going to happen in the long run. We see the short-run effects, but there are more news now coming to say that even people who did not show, some of the people who did not show any symptoms are actually having some problems, some health problems. So because of these things, it would have been very risky and dangerous, in fact, to say we're just gonna let the economy stay open and we'll get so many deaths and that's okay. So this is completely wrong. And of course, I am of the opinion that human life has to be first. You're asking me for a solution, and I wish I had one. But here is to me just to give you my a final word on my view on this. In the face of high uncertainty and so much ignorance about these things, we were better off going with what we knew. And what we knew was social distancing, lockdowns, things that have been tried by humanity anytime they had a pandemic.
But what is the solution? I mean, you're totally right that human lives are more important, but without the economy, life will not be sustained for a long time.
Yes, but then nobody said that this virus is going to be here for 10, 20 years. There were two tracks that were, at least two important tracks that were taking place. One was the work for a vaccine, but there was also the other work that we don't talk about a lot, which was the work for treatment. And that to me is a lot more promising, because if we do not know that the vaccine would help us for a long period of time, then we're better off working with treatment, same way we do with treatment for malaria.
Do you agree with the assumption that, surrendering lives in hope that the economy will operate at normal speed during the health crisis of this magnitude would almost certainly backfire? Or is there maybe a point reached where you have to open part of the economy? If you look in the United States, they try the dual way and they don't succeed. So how can we succeed if this virus will not be contained over a year or two or three?
We need to invest a lot more in treatments. This is exactly the point I just made. If the vaccine is not going to be effective beyond 3, 6 or months or even 1 year, I think investing in treatment is a much more promising avenue. Of course, in the United States, really, I think we exaggerated lots of things. The US. Almost 100% of the population has access to the internet, right? Or at least a very high number of percentage. Lots of things we can do. The US economy is mostly a service economy these days. Lots of things we can do. We can do it from home, right? We can, yes, of course it has its drawbacks. And we know we have problems, but this is a learning process. Lots of people complain the teaching online might not be that great, but then with time, people will get used to it. They will fix all the problems and so on. Now, it is possible to do partial openings, and I think Morocco tried it. Even when they were saying there is a lockdown, there were many businesses like slaughterhouses and things like that were still open in Morocco, and they still, during that period of time at least, they had a good handle on the disease. So I think we can do partial openings. We can also do alternate openings. The alternate openings are fine because by the time you open, you would have reduced the number of people hospitalized, and then if you get new infections, you have actually beds, and you have nurses and people who can take care of them that are available.
But your argument, which is constructive and very thoughtful, is correct. But how long can you expect of people in tough neighborhoods which are ready and who are already suffering? How much time can you give them until they, in parentheses or not parentheses, revolt?
Okay, now people in poor neighborhoods exist everywhere. They are a lot more common, of course, or more in population in the South, in the global South, but they exist even in the United States. In our southern states in the US, you have people, you have really poverty. I mean, I saw poverty during Katrina.
Yes.
That we had, and that's really very poor, even poorer than certain poor regions in Morocco. That's as simple as that. And this is the United States. Now, to me, there are two things. First of all, the preventive measures are a lot more than the measures you do when you're stuck and you have a pandemic. These things, this type of poverty and the needs of people should have dealt with before pandemics, before we have a problem. And this is the responsibility of governments, local and national governments. For example, in many poor countries, you don't have, or less developed countries, if you want, you have a complete lack of social protection for people, for most people who don't work in the formal sector, right? And that's a problem. What can you do for these people? Again, things should have been done before the pandemic. Now that we have the pandemic, you have many governments around the world that came up with lots of nice schemes or ideas to help poor people in Latin America, in North Africa, in Morocco, for example. The governments try to even give subsidies or help people who are not even in the formal sector, people who have never been registered with the government and probably never paid a tax on whatever they sell.
But in your study, you mentioned an estimate by the International Labour Organization suggesting that around the globe, 1.6 billion informal economy workers have been drastically impacted by lockdown measures, and that informal workers in Latin America and Africa would register 81% decline in earnings. Again, the question I asked you before, how long will the informal sector need time to recover, and how much of suffering does that mean for our societies?
Okay, so the time, if you're asking me how long it's going to take after the pandemic has ended, or is it during the pandemic has ended?
Pandemic has ended.
After it has ended.
Yes.
The answer to how long is how much and how serious is the government of whatever country we're talking about serious about solving problems, okay, or this type of problems. One is to just come up and set in place a system of social protection. And my understanding is that Morocco has already embarked on that, or at least there is talk of social protection for people who are not in the formal or the enterprises and things like that where they are registered. I think maybe, I don't know, but maybe in my view, a question should be, how can governments solve the problems? Because they have to solve it. You cannot let millions of people in the informal sector just disappear because they're going to be hungry, and then day after day they're not going to have access to food, and one day they're going to die, right? You're going to have famine and they're going to die. We cannot let that go on. So the question would be, are the governments prepared to take on this task of really changing things, doing some kind of a structural transformation in their societies to make sure that when you have people who are registered in the formal sector, they still can get help when you have a pandemic like this one, when you have a natural disaster? This could have been an earthquake. This could have been a tsunami, right? And the story would be the same. They are not registered in the official system. They're not going to get social security, then social protection. They're not going to get social insurance. The how long really depends on how serious and how prepared the governments are. It might be, and this has nothing to do with whether you are a very rich country or a poor country. We know that even in some wealthy countries, whether it's in Europe or in the United States or in North America, in some wealthy countries, the problems are pretty much the same. They haven't been really very serious about helping poor people. They haven't. One other thing that I think of is, if there is really a good time or a justifiable time to have a large budget deficit, it's normally during crises, right? So we in economics, we say that it's okay to have a large budget deficit in a recession, because the idea is that you're going to run a surplus when the economy is strong, right? So for me, to have a large budget deficit, if you are doing the right thing during a crisis like this, it's okay. So the governments have really to spend the money and have to take care of people.
But if you look at the example, I agree with you, but if you look at the example of Brazil, for example, a country of lots of promises in South America, with great potential in South America, they don't fight at the moment the pandemic. They think that's going to be solved by time, and they're not helping the people. So what does a country like Brazil show to?
Well, again, because remember that I said it depends on how serious the government is. So in Brazil, you have the big denial of COVID-19 with the political leadership there. The same way we had with the Trump administration in this country. So if you are denying something, you're not even going to think about trying to solve it, right? So you don't even think that there are people suffering from it. So these people are really living in a different universe, because we know that this is real. We know it kills people. Yes, we know. And by the way, we know the virus kills people more than in America, especially. We already reached at least 500,000 people dead, right? That's over 500,000 people. A lot less than that, people committed suicide and died supposedly from lack of means during the Great Recession, not the Great Depression, but during the Great Recession. Okay. Yes. So really, I mean, we can do it. We can live with this. Now, Brazil, unfortunately, you talked about the potential. Brazil has a huge human and economic potential due to all the resources they have. What the potential that's lacking in Brazil right now is the political leadership. So they don't have a good political leadership.
You mentioned in your paper that access to information and communication technology has proven particularly crucial during the pandemic, as it can enable a country to save lives and the economy. Which nations, in your opinion, in Africa, for example, were suffering the most because of the lack of access to ICT?
Well, thank you. That's really a great question. I'm a true believer in the power of ICT when it's put in the right hands and those who need it, and also when there are institutional framework that really makes it beneficial for people. Of course, putting ICT in a country where the illiteracy rate is still 50% is not really going to be very, very helpful to the country as a whole. However, ICT, mobile telephony especially, and smart technology that works with the mobile phones, have proved important and have played an important role during the pandemic, because you could use it for information from the government when there are restrictions. People could use it to get information on which businesses are open, at what time, who can go there, who cannot go. Right now, they use it for the vaccine, like to register and all these things. So that's really very important. Unfortunately, when it comes to what works with mobile phones to make them smart, which is the internet, basically, the story is different. So while in many African countries, the access to mobile phones is very high, access to the internet and use of the internet is very low. Africa definitely lags behind the rest of the world in this as a whole, as a continent. And if you look at the ITU, which is the International Telecommunication Union, it's part of the United Nations agency, one of the agencies of the UN. When I looked at their data recently, they show a rate of penetration, which is the percentage of the population who can access the internet. They show the rate of penetration in Africa as a whole, on average, is 43%. While this rate in the rest of the world is about 69%, more exactly 68.6%. But that's average, and your averages sometimes don't tell you the real story. So now you come to Africa within the continent, and you find three things. Well, you find first of all, you find a huge divergence or divide between certain countries and other countries. So there is a digital divide within Africa itself, and then if you look at it by sub-region, sometimes we say, like, you try to imitate your neighbors, so that you would think if you divide Africa into its 5 sub-regions, people in the same sub-region would have the same thing. You don't find that. Huge digital divide again, Eastern Africa especially, and then in Western Africa. And then within the countries, there is another problem. As we all know, there is lack of infrastructure, lack of electricity, and some African countries like Burundi, like Ethiopia, still have a very high percentage of rural population. And to get those things to the rural population is very costly, and we know those countries usually tend to be among the poorest. Now, you asked me which country has the lowest rate of, for example, access to the internet. According
suffering the most because of lack of infrastructure.
Well, suffering the most, it's kind of, we wouldn't really know unless we go and do detailed studies of the countries. What one can say is maybe the country that has the lowest rate, because we know that the effects of social distancing are pretty much the same on everybody, right? And we know that all these countries, because they tend to be on the very low income, like the lower income brackets in the continent, that many of the people that are working in the informal sector. Okay, so when you put these two together, you know that lack of access to ICT will affect people. So I can tell you the story about which country has the lowest and which country has the highest in Africa. And you can see from the data that are presented, even though you can see, for example, if I tell you that in Africa, Kenya, right? Who would believe, right? More than South Africa. Kenya has a penetration rate of 85%, higher than any other country in the continent. And Kenya is on the eastern side of Africa, right? But when you take Ethiopia and the others, it's lower than 20%. In fact, Eritrea has the lowest rate, which is less than 7%. Which tells you this: if less than 7% of the population have access to the internet, how are they going to report anything? Even the data reported about the infections, I wouldn't believe it. I wouldn't believe that data. I mean, really, it makes it very hard to report anything, to understand what the government is saying. And now I hope that the ONG, the non-governmental, actually, non-governmental organization, NGOs, I hope that they are going to go there, and they are already there probably, and really make sure that people get the vaccine, or at least get the information about it, and then decide whether they want to do vaccines or not. Because this is really a problematic thing. I mean, in Kenya, for example, I'm not worried. All they have to do is send a message, and people will get the information.
Let me ask you a final question on a happier note. If you look at the European nations, which are very developed in technology, they're almost failing in their vaccination program. You mentioned Morocco, which has an almost perfect system of alerting the people by computer, through computer, and they look like they have never looked better in technology than at this period of time. How do you explain that?
Lots of things. There is all of a sudden a mistrust for science in North America in general and in Europe, in the places where there is lots of scientific discovery. I mean, Germany, who would believe that Germans would not believe science? But there are lots of people in Germany who are against vaccines. They don't want to do this vaccine. And I don't know, I don't know because I'm not German, but I don't know where this comes from. Maybe part of it is because there was so much hype around this virus instead of really just cleaning out and giving only the truth to people. But even before that, there was so many things we didn't know. Up to now, there are people who are convinced, and I'm one of them. We're not certain really where this virus came from. But what we're certain of is that it can kill. That we know. So why not work with the things we know and then let the rest that we mistrust and we don't know and for another day. I'm sure that once the dust settles, that somebody's going to be held responsible for this, and I'm hoping that the UN will take on the charge to really, or the WHO, the World Health Organization, will make sure that they try to get to the bottom of this, because this is not going to be the first time or the last time a virus will hit humanity, and we come from somewhere where if we had made just an extra effort to make sure that for a month or for 2 months, there is no international flights to that part of the world where we think the thing came from. And I'm not certain it came from there, but if we suppose it came from China, for example, then if we had worked with Chinese government, if they had told us and we worked with them and said, okay, everybody stays put, let's all help China, make sure this doesn't get out of the country, then we will be here talking about this today. But this didn't happen, so.
Mrs. Baliamoune, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.